ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from the Mulago Foundation, Kristin Gilliss.
Hello. Good afternoon and happy Earth Day. I'm Kristin Gilliss, Mora from the Mulago Foundation. I'm really excited to welcome you to the session on conservation and social entrepreneurship at the inaugural Earth Optimism Summit. I assume that all of you are here at the summit because you probably consider yourself optimists. Glass is half full people. I consider myself in that category. So what I want you to know about social entrepreneurs is that they think the glass is half full too, but they also think that there is a giant pitcher of water sitting next to the glass, and they are going to figure out a way to get that water into the glass and overflowing, and they're going to figure out a way to get you to help them do it too. They are the most pure form of optimists. Mulago, where I work, invests in those people, pitcher people, social entrepreneurs. We invest in scalable solutions to basic needs of the very poor. We look for the best solutions to big problems in poor places. And we support people to design their work for impact and scale. I'm really excited to be here because we've been particularly interested in the intersection of poverty and conservation. And I find myself much more often at development conferences where it's striking how there is a divide between conservation and development, and we feel really strongly that conservation divorced from development will fail. So it's nice to be here today and to be talking about social entrepreneurship, which has great traction in the development space. And I think the conservation space could learn from that. So in the human development sector, the trends are actually pretty positive. Like, more kids are vaccinated, more girls are in school, fewer kids are dying, generally positive. The one area where the indicators and trends bow in the wrong direction is conservation and environment. So I think we're all here because we believe we can bend the arc. Mulago's most recent commitment to that was to create a conservation fellowship that supports social entrepreneurs to design for impact and scale. And I'm very excited for you to meet a few of our fellows today and a few not. But I think what they represent is really exciting, and I want to make sure that we all have the same idea of what social entrepreneurship or conservation entrepreneur means before they come on stage. So social entrepreneurship, of course, is just a construct, but it is a construct that's been useful in the poverty alleviation space. Basically, it borrows and is informed by the ethos and, of course, the jargon of business and finance and Silicon Valley, where entrepreneurship is prized. So the business ideology really informs the way Mulago thinks of itself. So we don't think of ourselves as grant makers. We think of ourselves as investors in impact. For us, impact is the analog of profit. The form of investment that we most often make is grants, but we still consider that an investment. And we're looking for the same kind of return as any investor, even though ours might be in the form of kids' lives saved, increase in income for poor farmers, or better and faster conservation outcomes. And like an equity investor, our grant funding is unrestricted because we believe we're investing in the mission of organizations, not projects. And we think that's the only way that you get to an exponential increase in impact, and we think there should be a lot more of that in the conservation sector. So in the development space where social entrepreneurship has great traction, you'll often hear the work of social entrepreneurs described as disruptive innovations. Definitely a nod to technology, but I think it's worth talking about a little bit and how it might be relevant for this space. So in the world of technology, a new idea or a new company can completely transform a marketplace, shift everyone to a new normal, new equilibrium really quickly. When is the last time you thought that was true in conservation? And why isn't it true? But think of the examples that you know and you see in your everyday life. Think of life before eBay. Before eBay, no one imagined you could have a financial transaction with a stranger online and that you would both honor that transaction. But eBay completely democratized the marketplace, which had implications not just for their own business, but for a lot of other new businesses who thought they could use that same idea and apply it too. They proved that you could trust a stranger. So now, I don't know about you, but I get in strangers' cars. I stay in strangers' apartments. I shopped for a husband online, and it worked. So for me, that's a new normal. And that's the type of thinking and borrowing and learning from other innovations that we would love to see more of in the conservation space. And we think the opportunity is there. So I would just ask that today, as I introduce our conservation entrepreneurs, you really think about the fact that in the world of technology, a new idea can transform the industry. The basic idea of social entrepreneurship is that that same concept could and should apply in the social sector too. And particularly in conservation, I think it really needs to. So with that, I want to introduce each of our social entrepreneurs. You'll have a chance to hear from them directly about their work, and then I'll have a chance to ask them a few questions. At the end, we'll bring everyone back on stage, and hopefully we can have some Q&A with the audience. Okay, so our first conservation entrepreneur is Dr. Alasdair Harris from Blue Ventures. Al is the founder and executive director. Blue Ventures works to rebuild tropical fisheries in poor coastal communities. You can trace Al's Earth optimism back to his early childhood years, immersed in the majestic beauty of Scotland and its wild spaces. By the time Al reached the University of Edinburgh, though, he had embraced a lifelong love of corals. And so when there, he was compelled to found the Coral Awareness and Research Expeditions Society, which didn't exist because most university students in Edinburgh weren't obsessed with corals and biodiversity hotspots. And then he found his way to Madagascar on expedition, and I think it's fair to say the heart of Blue Ventures has been there ever since. Al has collected degrees from Oxford, fellowships from TED, Ashoka, and Mulago, and prestigious awards like the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship and the WWF Duke of Edinburgh Conservation Award. Please welcome Dr. Al Harris.
Good afternoon. The story I want to share with you today begins with a journey. It's a voyage that begins this month and happens every year here in the Indian Ocean. This journey confronts us with some of the formidable challenges as well as some of the extraordinary opportunities that exist in tropical marine conservation today. This is Zoe. He's heading on a voyage. He's a fisherman on the Indian Ocean island of Madagascar, where I first started working as a marine biologist 15 years ago. His journey will take him almost 1,000 kilometers, sailing north by dugout canoe with his brothers and his cousins. They travel with no lights, no navigation equipment, no sounder, no engine, often sailing many dozens of miles out to sea. This is a remote and starkly beautiful corner of Africa, some of the continent's biggest coral reefs and mangrove forests, home to some of the highest densities and diversities of marine life found anywhere on the planet, second only to the Southeast Asian Coral Triangle. Zoe's destination is here, the aptly named Barren Isles archipelago, tiny sand keys remote in the Mozambique Channel, where Zoe and many hundreds like him will make their home for most of the next year, targeting the few remaining fish stocks that are still abundant in these exceptionally remote waters. Zoe's family are Vezu, traditional nomadic seafaring people from coastal southern Madagascar who depend intimately on the sea. All family members fish every day. In this remote, arid environment, there's really no alternative, and our research shows that seafood here accounts for the sole source of dietary protein in 99% of household meals. This is Melantine. She's from Zoe's neighboring village, but isn't able to make that very long and arduous journey north with the migrants. Like most women, she fishes on foot at low tide, targeting invertebrates like octopus on the reef flat with a spear. When Melantine was a girl, she remembers that it used to take her several hours to walk across this reef because it was so thick with the heads of living coral. Back then, she could catch up to 30 large octopus on a single outing. But she had to be very careful to get out of the water before the incoming tide had reached her waist because of the risk of attracting the attention of overly curious sharks. Today, there are no sharks, and she can walk across that same reef in just a few minutes because there's so little living coral to block her way. And with her sharp eyes scouring that reef for several hours, she's lucky if she'll catch 2 or 3 juvenile octopus. In her lifetime, Melantine has seen the collapse of this once extraordinary, magnificent coral reef ecosystem. Now, the Vezu are not alone. Hundreds of millions of people like Zoe and Melantine are confronted with the very human reality of our planet's tropical marine biodiversity crisis from one day to the next. There is an alternative direction that this narrative can take in line with the Earth Optimism Summit, because there's a breathtakingly simple tool out there for rebuilding fisheries. We know that recovery of marine ecosystems within and around marine reserves can be so effective that if we can scale up protection to around a third of our oceans, we're in with a chance of rebuilding fish stocks worldwide. And yet we're currently protecting less than a fifth of this target, and evidence suggests that the vast majority of those existing marine reserves are failing, being resented rather than defended by the communities that live around them. Time and again, tropical marine conservation efforts fail to capture that essential local buy-in, and all too often only alienate and disenfranchise the very people who should count on their success. Back in Melantine's village, her community has shown me how we can reimagine this relationship between people and conservation. It just so happens that some species can recover phenomenally quickly with protection, like this tropical octopus that grows at exponential rates. Octopus gleaned on coral reefs here in southern Madagascar are exported all the way to Europe, one species underpinning an entire coastal economy in a place where fishing is the only job on offer. A decade ago, catches here were starting to fall. The outlook wasn't good. Melantine's village decided to set aside a very small area of the reef where they usually catch octopus for just a few months to see what would happen. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a Malagasy fisherwoman used to landing octopus at about 400, 500 grams, immature. Now imagine how it feels when you pull out a bigger octopus from the water, around 10 times that size, 4 or 5 kilograms. That's exactly what happened when Melantine's village reopened its fishery. People saw and people talked. Soon, neighbors were replicating this model, and in a decade, it's gone literally viral, being replicated hundreds of times along one of the longest coastlines in Africa. This model for local fisheries management is growing every year. It's spawned new fishing legislation, it's crossed borders, and it's now being adapted to other fisheries across the Indian Ocean. Crucially, our research shows that this model yields real monetary profits with a monthly internal rate of return of 92%. That's exceeding any investment opportunity on the market. So here in some of the poorest communities on the planet, we're learning that conservation can be one of the highest yielding investment opportunities on Earth. And having seen this, something quite remarkable is happening. These same communities have started raising the bar, creating permanent marine reserves within vast, locally managed conservation areas around critical coral reefs, seagrasses, and mangrove forests. And 10 years on from those first reserves, we're starting to see enduring conservation impacts. Fish biomass, the definitive indicator for marine protected area effectiveness, has started to build relative to areas outside. And these communities are going further still, securing definitive legal access rights for their fisheries, and in doing so, eliminating destructive industrial fishing vessels from their waters. In just a decade, this movement has grown to reach 15% of Madagascar's inshore seabed and reach almost a third of 1 million people. What started as a prototype for local village-level fisheries management has scaled into a national grassroots movement for marine protection and the human rights of fishers to their resources. That's been achieved on a modest budget and very, very little outside help. It's even prompted the country's president to pledge to further triple the total area of ocean that's protected and to establish new legislation to secure local access rights to fisheries. Over the last 15 years, I've had the enormous privilege of helping to build this grassroots movement for marine protection. My organization, Blue Ventures, builds learning networks of community groups to share this profound local experience in fisheries management and help drive further expansion of this movement. We're already working with communities and partners across 9 countries around the Indian Ocean, connecting communities to share these stories and learnings and experiences, but particularly we do this through these barefoot grassroots community exchanges, because we're learning that this movement is inspired not by conversations that are taking place on conference stages or in the pages of scientific journals, but on the beaches and the landing stations that are around our coasts. That's very much where the magic is happening. So Zoe and Melantine's journeys, their sacrifices, their struggles, they illustrate the inextricable links between people and nature that really set the stage for our work as marine conservationists in the 21st century. Ignoring these links risks perpetuating broken models of marine conservation. Exploring and understanding them, just as the Vezu are doing here in Madagascar, can transform our work as conservationists into a story that's about abundance and not austerity. Because with the right models, we have a hope of scaling up our work and ultimately of engaging the hundreds of millions of people that work in and around fishing to work with us and not against us. Thanks.
We're going to keep you out here, Al. So when I met you probably 4 years ago, I think you self-identified more as a scientist than a social entrepreneur. And we're all celebrating science and informed decision-making today. But I'd be really interested in hearing how, as a scientist, the idea of social entrepreneurship has been useful for you in your work.
Social entrepreneurship for me as an ecologist, I trained as a biologist, an ecologist, and I left university and I had this weird idea to set up an organization, and no one in their right mind would obviously give me money to do this kind of work. So I had to create a business to fund it. And so Blue Ventures started out as a social enterprise using tourism to create the financial engine and the cash flow to fund our operations and give us the breathing space to explore incentive-based models for conservation. Taking that thinking and applying it to how we work as conservationists forces us to think about systems change and scale and the replicability of what we're doing. Of course, everything we do is grounded in science.
Not always, of course, but I know for you it is, of course. So I want to ask you something else. I know something you didn't really talk about, but is very important to Blue Ventures, is integrating your work with population, reproductive health, family planning. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that seems to me an example of something that maybe the whole sector could move towards
Sure.
thinking about more. Like, why do you think that's important in conservation?
You only gave me 6 minutes, so I couldn't mention that one. So our work is very much led by, the models we develop are led by communities. We haven't come up with them ourselves. Yeah. And for a very long time, communities used to explain to us that the conservation intervention, and they saw it very much as an environmental intervention, that they most needed was healthcare. And we, of course, coming from the establishment, said, no, we're biologists, we count things, we can't possibly provide healthcare. And so 10 years ago, we finally opened up our first clinic. And today we're providing weekly health services to about 50,000 people through a cost-neutral, community-based distributor model that's had an extraordinary impact, not only directly on health outcomes, for example, reducing the general fertility rate in coastal southwestern Madagascar by 40%, or increasing the contraceptive prevalence rate from very low to about 55%. But it's had a transformative impact on engaging women in conservation. We're seeing that the synergistic value of integrating health and environmental management creates a kind of 2 + 2 = 5 scenario. So we're fascinated by this, and we're also focused very much on advocating for integrated programming in conservation and health.
Yeah, and I'm glad you are. So the other question I want to ask you that also relates to advocating and working with others is, I know that you want to be kind of open source with what you've learned at Blue Ventures. You want other people to adopt this model in the localities where they're working. Because we're going to be optimistic, tell us what the biggest barrier is to getting partners to deliver this model in other places, and then why are you optimistic about overcoming that barrier?
Opportunity cost is the fundamental challenge. It's the $20 million question we face. How can we possibly overcome what is seen as a huge sacrifice, foregoing fishing in a closed area for just a few months? Discount rates in coastal developing countries are very, very high, so the economic preference for a return on an investment in conservation today rather than next week is very strong, particularly in subsistence communities. So we have to find ways that can return that reward quite visibly and tangibly in a relatively short time frame. And that's one of the reasons that we've focused a lot of our work on these very fast-growing catalytic species that show such very, very rapid growth rates.
But tell me, just to cut you off, I want to know specifically about getting other conservation organizations to adopt your model, not the community, because I think you did a good job of talking about making sure incentives are aligned with communities, but what about other conservation organizations?
Well, when we're trying to scale up our work, it's not always through conservation organizations. It's typically through fisheries management groups or community organizations. And the single most important thing that we look for is credibility and a close closeness and a trust with the fishing community that we want to work with. Once we've identified an area where there's a market for instance, tropical octopus, we'll look for that CBO, it could be an NGO. Expertise in fisheries management isn't important. We can provide training in that, but what is important is that local trust. And often that's lacking, as we know, in conservation organizations.
I trust you, Al. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Our next speaker is Dr. Leela Hazzah, the founder and co-founder and executive director of Lion Guardians. Leela's commitment to lions traces back to her childhood in Egypt. Her father told stories of hearing lions roar as he fell asleep as a child, and Leela yearned to hear them. He told her they were now extinct. Today, she works with communities in Africa to make sure that they always hear lions roar. She also came to this work as a scientist with a conservation biology PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on understanding the predictors and motivations behind lion killing in Masai land. She also has been recognized with many awards during her career over more than 15 years of work in East Africa. These awards include the CNN Hero Award, Future of Nature, and St. Andrew's Prize for the Environment. Please welcome Leela Hazzah.
Hello, everyone. I am very excited to be here to tell you a story about an innovative approach to lion conservation that actually seems to be working. One that is transforming lion killers into conservationists. I remember about 10 years ago, I was in a dusty town in southern Tanzania, very close to Mount Kilimanjaro, and I met a Masai warrior named Mitirenanga. That was the name he was given after he killed his first lion. And I remember the day that I met him, he had just been released from jail for killing his 8th lion. And he was so angry at the government for arresting him. He said he didn't understand why he was arrested because he was just protecting his favorite cow. That is a story that I hear often working in communities in Masai land. In the last 20 years, lions have declined by more than 40% throughout Africa. The most recent estimate is that there are less than 20,000 lions left on the continent, with more than half of what's remaining actually found in East Africa. So that's why we focus our work there. The problem with lions is simple. People are killing them. And our core challenge is, how do we get people to stop killing lions? How do we achieve this behavior change? So 10 years ago, we founded Lion Guardians with the aim of directly addressing this issue of lion killing. And when I first moved to southern Kenya around the Maliasili ecosystem, I remember there was just numerous lions being killed. I actually remember picking up dead carcasses of lions more than actually seeing living lions. And that really disturbed me. And I thought at that point, we really needed an entrepreneurial solution that was developed with the local communities and based on their cultural values. And so Lion Guardians is based on 3 main pillars to achieve success. First, we focus on conflict mitigation. If we can prevent lions from eating people's livestock, there would be less chance that they would retaliate and kill lions. Secondly, if we can engage warriors and their traditional knowledge of the environment around lion monitoring, they would get a greater sense of ownership over the lions. And also, we would get better ecological data on lion populations. And finally, by recruiting past lion killers, they're able to use their influence and prestige in their communities to prevent lions from being hunted. And I want to play a very brief video from Mitirenanga, the warrior I talked about at the first slide. He became a lion guardian a year after I met him in that town.
Mara ala yankadi la ribo lo ngesi ore nara nakatanji ore apa nanu tedukuya aata pake nanu enkanyit ore pa bondu gerre mara ala yankadi naitoki apa enkanyit saidi alang apa tiana inepu ninye ara inepu enkerai kiti pa inepu nya oltung'ani fulani abala ala inepu meeta enikunaki peyie agilu amu mayiolo airorie naata sii enkanyit metaa meidimayu peyie agilu maata oltung'ani lashe enchata.
What's incredible here is that when Mitirananga joined the Lion Guardians team, he's been able to prevent over 50 lion hunts just himself. So these 3 pillars that I've mentioned, what we hypothesized is that they would lead to a reduction in lion killing and a stabilization of the lion population. That was our overall aim in producing this model. And so have we been successful? Have we been successful at reducing lion killing? Well, we've nearly eliminated lion killing at our core site in southern Kenya. And this is very much in partnerships with other collaborators in the area. But we've had similar results in the expansion sites where we work with partners in Tanzania. So it really seems to be working at reducing lion killing. In terms of stabilizing the lion population, well, I think we exceeded our expectations, and we've more than tripled the lion population in southern Kenya at our core site. Well, what's very meaningful here is that this is one of the only places in all of Africa where the lion population is actually increasing in community lands outside protected areas. So I think these results speak for themselves. I mean, they show how innovation, like Lion Guardians, although it was radically different from other approaches at the time, can have real impacts on the ground. So at that point, once we realized we actually had something that was working, we kept asking ourselves, how can we scale this up? How can we have similar impacts elsewhere? And at that point, we went above and beyond our core expertise, trying to expand our model in different countries, different cultures. And we found that our ability to innovate was limited by doing that type of approach. And so we took a step back then, and I think this was quite an important time for Lion Guardians in terms of maturity and growth as an organization. And we started to strategize how we can broaden our impacts in the conservation space. And in doing so, we realized that we had many spheres of influence, and that we really believe that, and we're currently testing, how we can share knowledge with other organizations, other places that are experiencing similar issues, and maybe we could have even bigger impacts altogether. And so when I'm talking about sharing knowledge, we do this in a lot of different ways. So we've actually franchised the Lion Guardian model and have taken it to sites that I've showed you in Tanzania. But we also provide a more tailored, customized training or coaching opportunity where we may take one of the 3 pillars I showed and actually adapt that to a specific area. But we've also pioneered a new software on facial recognition for lions to be able to identify lions when they're moving across large landscapes. And we're also collaborating with a lot of conservation groups across Africa, trying to share ideas and best practices so we can have bigger impacts altogether. So, I would say as Lion Guardians, we are very hopeful about the future of people and lions coexisting. And I think that's because we really believe that there are many conservation entrepreneurs like Mitirananga who are out there who really have the skills and the capabilities to engage in the conservation arena and have these big impacts to be able to reduce the decline of wildlife across the continent and hopefully even bigger around the globe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leela. So I have to ask you, the name Lion Guardians and your talk really suggested that you're focused on individual species preservation. How do you think about also making sure that those lions have a healthy ecosystem to thrive in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that we adopted the name Lion Guardians. It was voted on by even all the guardians when we first started because we like that name, but we do focus on a lot of other species. We do elephant guardian. We have a lot of other work, but I think because lions are a keystone species, by conserving them, you're actually conserving everything under them, from prey species to the water table to the grasses. And so definitely by targeting a keystone species, we're able to conserve a lot more than just lions.
Yeah. So the results that you shared in the area where you're working are really incredible and exciting. Help us understand what happens if a lion wanders 5 kilometers north or south or outside of an area where you're working, how you have to think about that in designing your model.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that we tackle all the time because lions do move. We had a lion that his home range was 6,500 square kilometers. So he moved from, southern Kenya all the way toward the Masai Mara down into Tanzania. I mean, so it's really hard to keep track of these lions. And I think that at the beginning we kept expanding. We continue to expand throughout, and now we cover about 4,000 square kilometers, but there's nowhere further south we can go. There's a political boundary, it's Tanzania, and if we go north, there's an ethnic boundary. And so I think those are our biggest limitations, is either an ethnic or political boundary, and we haven't really resolved. I mean, we're gonna be partnering with a group now in Tanzania to be able to start working across the border. But we just have to be innovative about how we go about doing that and continue to open up spaces for animals to move through.
And what do you think the biggest barrier is to other communities adopting this model?
Well, I think that some of them, they just don't know this exists. I think that's part of it. It's just being able to get that out there. And we've made a film, we made an educational film both in Swahili and Masai that we try to distribute out in East Africa so people know that this model does exist and that it's all about communities and they make the decisions about if they want to live and how they want to live with wildlife. So I think that's it. But there's also a funding limitation. I mean, it costs. It's not free to run these things. There's salaries that we pay, even though it's not very much. It's $100 a month to pay for a lion guardian. But it costs, and so I think that's definitely one of our biggest limitations in being able to scale up this model to other places.
And I really liked how you talked about the guardians as conservationists. And they are true conservationists, and yet they're probably not reading the same peer-reviewed journals that a lot of people in this room have access to. How do you make sure that they know what the latest thinking and science is that might be relevant to your work? And how do you also make sure that what they learn feeds back into communities like this?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So we have forums once or twice a year where we bring all the guardians together. We have one where we bring all the guardians, even from Tanzania, into Kenya as well, and we talk about what the data is showing, because they're the ones collecting the data, and we review the data, and then we talk about the big challenges. We're having a lot of conflict in this area. What do we do? And we come up with those solutions together, and then we talk about what we've heard about what's happening in Madagascar, or in this paper, this was written about this. Do they think that would be culturally appropriate to try in this area? So they're very much part of that decision making, and definitely the data that's being collected when it's being published, they know about that as well. I mean, it's very important because they're the ones that are making those decisions as well.
So what are you going to share with your team about the Earth Optimism Summit when you go back?
Well, I'd love to let them know how hopeful things are. And I think that, we're at a point right now where it's very dry. We haven't had rain for a very long time. So people are really suffering and they're feeling really down about things. And conflict with both elephants and lions is very high in our area. So I've been listening to all of these amazing ideas everywhere. So I'm excited to take all those ideas back and see how we can brainstorm to continue to improve things in our area.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, too.
So our next conservation entrepreneur is Margarita Mora, who leads the Conservation Stewards Program at Conservation International. The Conservation Stewards Program has pioneered the use of conservation agreements to achieve lasting conservation by delivering concrete benefits to communities in exchange for protecting natural resources. And I can guarantee you that Margarita is truly the best person in the world to lead this program. I think she knows more about conservation agreements than anyone else. Her first job after university in Ecuador was working on one of the world's first conservation agreement initiatives. She did her master's on conservation agreement theory. And today, she's leading conservation agreements around the world through CI. For Margarita, being interested in nature really started with appreciating beauty worth saving in Ecuador, where she's from. So when she was just 3 months old, her parents took her camping for the first time. And then after that, they took her camping every week until she was 13. So by the time she was 21, through camping, she had seen almost all of Ecuador. And it's one of the reasons why she was so committed to saving beautiful places there and in other parts of the world. Please welcome Margarita Mora.
Well, it is fantastic seeing so many people here. We were really worried about the march outside and that you weren't going to be with us today. I am going to talk to you about the conservation agreements approach that CI developed several years ago. But before getting there, I want to share with you a bit of my own experience in Northwest Ecuador. When I was about 21, I heard everyone talking about Northwest Ecuador with this high biodiversity and this area where it rained all of the time. When I actually got there, the biodiversity was as amazing as they had told me. But what I also found was that there were a lot of indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities that didn't have basic services, that have very poor education opportunities, and that there were no health services at all nearby. Nevertheless, here I found some of the happiest kids I've ever seen in my entire life. So that made me think that if I am really interested in conservation, we need to think about people, and conservation has to become beneficial for people. If you think what is going on around the world, actually most of the lands and waters are in the hands of indigenous communities and traditional landholders. What they want are the same opportunities as we have. Our job is to make that happen while they preserve their nature. Conservation agreements are win-win deals that allow communities to protect their natural resources that we all cherish as human beings, and at the same time receive benefits from that kind of protection. Basically, the conservation agreements have two main components. On one side, through a very respectful and transparent process with the communities, conservation actions are defined based on the threats to biodiversity. And examples of conservation actions around the world include communities committing to no poaching, no forest clearing, and to do patrolling activities. On the other side, we define together with the communities the benefit package, something that is going to be of interest to them and beneficial for them. We define these, and we use the opportunity cost analysis as a reference because we want to make sure that we are supporting the communities as much as we can based on the effort that they are actually doing and recognizing how much they are losing when choosing conservation. Examples of benefits include social services, livelihood support, but also conservation wages. In addition to these two main components, we also define together with the communities what are the consequences of not complying with the agreement and how the monitoring is actually going to be carried out. I want to share with you a small example of how conservation agreements are actually being implemented in the Colombian Amazon. It is an area just in the border between Colombia and Brazil. And when we started working there 8 years ago, the main issue was that these communities had these vast lands, however, and lakes, beautiful lakes. However, fishermen from Brazil and from their own communities were taking as much fish as possible, and it was becoming a food security issue. Communities were interested in protecting, but they didn't have the means to do so. After negotiations with the communities, a conservation agreement was agreed upon. Communities commit to not fishing these two main commercial species, to using only artisanal gear, and to do the patrolling activities of those lakes and surrounding forests on a permanent basis. On the other side, in this case, Conservation International in Colombia committed to provide patrolling wages for the people that were there for an entire month, equipment to do the patrolling activities. They also committed to support their Natural Resources Committee, as well as providing additional funds so that the communities could decide how they can improve their communal lands and infrastructure. Currently, after 8 years, that area and those communities are protecting more than 200,000 hectares of forest and the water bodies that are there. And the initiative is supporting more than 1,000 people, like a friend who is sitting there in the boat during the patrolling activities. We have seen that actually the fish population have increased greatly in the areas where the conservation agreements are under implementation. And when doing the analysis of deforestation, despite this entire region having very low deforestation rates, deforestation in these communities is less than half of what is happening in other areas nearby. We believe that this model is the right for an area that is remote and territories that are managed by communities. And we have been lucky enough that the environmental authority in that part of the country is also looking at this as an alternative to be replicated in other areas. And it has been actually one of the main funders of this initiative. The example in Colombia is just one example of one conservation agreement. There are more than 4,000 conservation agreements at the moment that are in place. Some of them are between governments and communities. Others are between NGOs and communities. Of course, there are the others that are between governments, NGOs, communities, and other actors. But actually, the point is that these conservation agreements are crafted with the right stakeholders. And these are being implemented in 19 countries and helping protect 4 million hectares around the globe. The conservation agreements are not only being used to protect tropical forests. We are using them as well to protect rangelands in Africa, to protect mangroves, and to protect other types of semi-tropical forests around the world. The important thing of the conservation agreements model that we have developed is that it is systematic and it is teachable. It is not me or my team doing the conservation agreements around the world, but it is actually working in large partnerships to make this happen. This is our network of practitioners. They are actually the experts on conservation agreements. I have the honor to be their spokeswoman or ambassador or however do you want to call it. But these are the people that are with the map up to the waist, working on conservation agreements around the world and sharing the same vision that community-led conservation is what is going to make conservation happen and remain around the world. Our goal is, in the next 5 years, to raise that and to have around 15 million hectares protected by communities under the conservation agreements model. We are planning to do this by expanding our current network of partners, by strengthening actually the sites we are working on and expanding those sites as well. Some of the key aspects that we are focusing on right now is training those partners, providing all of the support they need to have strong conservation agreements. We are also focusing on brokering deals between donors interested in these kind of initiatives and the partners on the ground that are doing a lot of the work. And also thinking about quality control and monitoring to make sure that the agreements that we are supporting are reaching the goals that we want to achieve. I don't know if you have seen outside the roadmap booth, but following the roadmap, I think that the time to take action is now. And actually, indigenous peoples and traditional landholders, whether in lands or waters, are the strongest stewards of nature. It is time to make sure that we all recognize their contribution to the entire humanity. So thank you very much for your time.
Nice job, Margarita. So the crowd here might not know that you were actually an incredible athlete and made a national team when you were still in high school, I think, right? So what sport did you play?
Volleyball.
Volleyball. Yeah, I had inside information about that. So if you think of volleyball, given your experience, there's not a lot of win-win games in volleyball, right? And I'm really struck by how you talked about win-win agreements. And I just want to understand, like, if that's really true. Like, are there really not losers? Like, is this the one area where everybody wins? And if so, how do you actually make sure that they're fair?
Well, actually, in the volleyball, yes, you might win a game against another team, but you actually have to cooperate within your team.
True.
If you don't work internally very well, you are never going to win, right? It is the same with the conservation agreements. It is about cooperating and figuring out a very straightforward process that goes from having a reality check whether conservation agreements can work in a setting, then going through a very respectful process of designing those conservation agreements with the partners that are on the ground and with the communities themselves. Not only with one group here or one group there, but following a process so that all of the voices of the communities are heard and the partners having the responsibility of making those voices heard in the discussions. In addition to that, is having strong implementation and strong monitoring. And thinking about the exit. For how long do we have to be in a site? And when is going to be enough funding and enough capacity within the communities to manage those sites in the long term?
Okay, so they are really win-win.
Yes.
Okay, so in order for them to be win-win, you just talked about 4,000 agreements in 19 countries. I'm walking you this way closer to the end. Tell us, where does all that money come from?
Well, it has been a really interesting adventure. Of course, we started this, and we still have the support of the Mulago Foundation. How I see this is that initial support from Mulago allowed us to test the conservation agreements in different settings and figure out what worked and what didn't work. The nice thing is that within CI and within the partner organizations we work with, they saw the results. So there was a time as a program that we didn't have as much funding to support others, but they kept doing these conservation agreements and raising funds from philanthropic donors, from bilateral cooperation and multilateral cooperation from the governments, actually. Okay. So there has been a wide spread of donors supporting these kind of initiatives.
That's great. And then, we've been talking about social entrepreneurs, which usually we think of as founders of startups and early stage organizations. You are at CI, one of the biggest environmental NGOs in the world. What's it like to be a social entrepreneur and trying to lead an innovative program within a big institution?
I think it is very similar to being a social entrepreneur anywhere. You need to have a good product. You need to have local entrepreneurs that are willing to jump into the water with you. And you need to know that you cannot push anyone to do the things that you want, but they have to do them themselves, right? That has been one of the main lessons to us. And it is about partnerships, and it is about collaboration, and it is about showing results in conservation. And after 10 years of doing this, we have shown that, right?
So tell me think about the big environmental NGOs, and I feel like we have to just acknowledge that there's a few organizations that in this sector have an incredible influence and play a really important role. And we have to think about how to use the footprint and assets and expertise of those big NGOs and make sure that when there are innovations, like we heard about from Al or Leela, the big NGOs are actually able to maybe absorb them in some way. Not the institutions, but the ideas. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. What do you think is the best way for smaller or local NGOs to engage with institutions like CI?
That is a really tricky question, right? Reality is that depending on the NGOs are made of people.
Right.
And you will find different kind of people in different NGOs. Probably for the smaller organizations, they need to find the right partners within those NGOs. There is always a fear that large NGOs are going to steal the ideas and they are going to portray them as their own and they are not going to recognize others. But I know many people within CI and actually within other organizations that are more than willing to share and to make sure that others are portrayed and not themselves.
Yeah.
I think that conservation is a matter of perspective. We need to work together in order to save the world. If we are just thinking on ourselves, not going to happen.
I think that's true too. And we're actually so lucky that it's not a competition. We're all working towards the same goal. And I think there needs to be a lot more sharing, like you're talking about. I know that you're interested in anyone, anywhere doing conservation agreements.
I know. So if you are doing conservation agreements, please talk to me. I am sure I am going to be super interested.
Okay. Thank you, Margarita.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to shake your hand. Okay. Our next conservation entrepreneur is Fred Nelson, the founder and executive director of Maliasili Initiatives, an organization that works with great African conservation organizations and helps to make them even better. Fred grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and part of his connection to nature started right here at the Smithsonian, at the awesome Natural History Museum, where I have learned he was both inspired by and had great fear of the giant whale exhibit that they had. Fred has worked on natural resource management and development in East Africa for almost 20 years, including a decade living in Tanzania. He started his career working on community conservation in Masai communities there. Today, he lives in the woods of Vermont, suspiciously near to Canada, where he has quietly yet assuredly become a central connector and intellect in the field of conservation in Africa. Please welcome Fred Nelson.
Afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here at this summit that's so focused on solutions. Maliasili Initiatives is very much a solutions-oriented organization. As Kristin said, we work with many of the outstanding African conservation organizations, work with them to help them achieve more and achieve more impact. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see as an emerging new generation of African conservation entrepreneurs that are delivering the kinds of solutions that we're all thinking about and talking about here at this conference, the kind of solutions that we need to face up to today's conservation challenges. And I think a core purpose for the session that we're doing here today is really to think about what kind of support do those kinds of organizations need. How can we help effective local creative organizations do more and achieve more together? So just to take a look at the big picture in African conservation. Conservation, I think, is inherently entrepreneurial. It's really the business of social change, about trying to get people to change their behaviors, to do things, to interact with nature and their environment in different ways, at an individual level, at a community level, at a national scale. In Africa, you have the juxtaposition of tremendous biological diversity and rapid social, economic, and institutional change. And conservation in that context is really about getting nature to deliver economic value, benefits for local people, to create the incentives for them to change their behavior and protect nature and to be stewards. And that's the change that we need. That's the change that we need at scale. To make nature valuable to communities, to create the incentives for them to be stewards and to protect the natural resources that their lives and livelihoods and communities depend on. And if we want impact at scale, then we need change at that scale. But the question is, where does that change come from? I think the answer is that predominantly that change comes from organizations. It comes from groups of people working together in creative and different ways, in networks and coalitions and alliances and social enterprises, coming together and solving problems. And I think in conservation, fundamentally, we need strong, effective local organizations that can deliver change. I think this is something that's often overlooked in the conservation field. There's a lot of individuals, often small project individuals off with a great idea and maybe creating impact at a project level, but how do we bring those together? How do we grow those? How do we scale those up into something larger and more impactful? I think that's a key question when we're talking about entrepreneurship in conservation. How do you help organizations go to scale? And Maliasili Initiatives was founded really to address that and think about how can we help effective local organizations to grow? How can we help them to be stronger, to sustain and expand their work and their impact? We look for organizations that are working to deliver conservation in a systematic way, that really have stumbled upon something unique and a great idea and a niche about how they can change the world and change their communities around them. And we've built up a portfolio over the past 5 years of what I think are some of the best and most entrepreneurial African conservations out there, some of which are here with us at this summit. For example, in southern Tanzania, we've worked with the Mpingo Conservation and Development Initiative, which has really pioneered community forestry in Tanzania and indeed in all of Africa, working across over 800,000 acres and unlocking the value chain from sustainable timber harvesting and helping communities to benefit from timber, protect village forests. They have the only Forestry Stewardship Council group certificate in all of Africa and have been a true pioneer in that field with great potential to expand and help communities protect more forests based on the value those forests provide. Another set of social entrepreneurs in different parts of Africa that are unlocking values of natural resources are groups working to make the connection between forest protection and climate change through emerging carbon markets, such as Biocarbon Partners BCP in Zambia, which developed one of the only triple gold certified forestry carbon or REDD offset projects, over 40,000 hectares in the lower Zambezi Valley of Zambia, and now working to scale that up, aiming for 1 million acres in some of Zambia's most important wildlife areas. Tapping into global markets and making them work for local landholders to create the incentives on the ground that drive change. in Tanzania, a group called Carbon Tanzania has created a local carbon market from scratch, working with tourism companies, persuading them to buy offsets as a part of their responsible tourism businesses, and then channeling that funding to indigenous communities such as Hazzah hunter-gatherers to provide them with resources to protect and steward their lands. That's the kind of creativity that we need in African conservation. Namibia is perhaps one of the most transformative examples of conservation entrepreneurship at scale. And IRDNC and John Kasona, who's here with us today at the conference and spoke earlier, have been the true pioneers in that, in making conservation work on a large scale and really turning on its head some of the assumptions and paradigms that drove conservation in the past. By granting local communities ownership and rights over wildlife and leveraging the economic value of that wildlife, they've enabled communal conservancies to expand over 50 million acres in Namibia, generate about $10 million from tourism and hunting and other sources of revenue per year. And I think core to that was really has been rethinking anti-poaching and protected area management and what's the relationship between people and wildlife to enable those changes to occur, to convert wildlife into an asset that can drive conservation in totally new ways on a new scale. And those kinds of ideas and models are spreading in different parts of Africa. In the Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya, one of Africa's most important wildlife areas, you see new types of conservancies with individual Masai landholders and some of Africa's leading ecotourism companies coming together and creating new joint ventures that integrate revenue from tourism, wildlife, livestock, and create new types of local conservation models that are rapidly expanding in that area and create the potential, the best hope really, for one of Africa's most important wildlife areas. In northern Tanzania, you see similar experiments to develop new types of conservancies. The Honey Guide Foundation trying to develop those and make those work in Tanzania across the border. So I think these are really a new generation of African conservation entrepreneurs that are working across different areas to unlock the value of natural systems, creating new solutions, creating new possibilities, new partnerships, new ways of thinking and doing, driving entrepreneurship in their own context. And I think that's really the conservation that we need today when we're thinking about conservation solutions. Now, the issue we want to raise is, and think about, if we think about these organizations and this kind of entrepreneurship as the key agents of change, as the key drivers of new ways of doing things, how are we in the conservation space supporting local entrepreneurship? How are we providing local organizations with the kind of external support or fostering entrepreneurship in the ways that we think and interact in terms of funding models, in terms of the skills to be entrepreneurial? Are we enabling local groups to do more? I think that's the conversation we need to have when we're thinking about how to drive solutions, and that's the conversation we also want to have here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. We actually are going to invite all of our speakers back on stage, and Fred, I'm going to ask you the first question when we're going back out here. Okay, so Fred, we're going to start with you, and then we're going to move to the audience for questions. So explain why you think social entrepreneurship is relevant and an important concept in conservation.
Well, I think social entrepreneurship has really captured a spirit of ambition, creativity, and transformation. And I think we need more ambitious thinking in conservation. We need more transformative thinking. We also need to do what a really important thing that social entrepreneurship has done has been bringing business concepts and business ways of thinking into the social sector, and we need more of that in the conservation sector. In terms of informing design, for example, thinking about prototyping, evaluating prototypes in a rigorous way, the way Lion Guardians has done, but we don't see a lot of that design that really borrows from those kinds of entrepreneurial ways of thinking.
Yeah, and I want to make sure everyone understood from your presentation what it is that you do with the organizations that are in your portfolio and how you work with them. So kind of quickly, what do you actually do with organizations like Lion Guardians?
Yeah, well, we basically provide customized organizational development support and work on things like strategy, communications, fundraising, board development, leadership. The organizational components that you need in order to put one foot in front of the other and figure out where you're going and how you're going to get there.
Well, if the rest of your portfolio is like Lion Guardians and Leela, then I think we're all in good shape, so that's awesome. Okay, so we're actually going to open it up for questions. There's microphones at the aisle if anyone has questions for any of our speakers.
Okay, we can go home and start drinking.
We might have one.
Yeah. Okay. So when you first go into communities that, they might have heard about other communities where you work and have brought conservation in, are they at first skeptical of what you're doing, or have they heard good things?
Why don't we start with Al?
Very good question. Our approach to introducing a concept in a new community, or our experience of trying to do that, is that it only works when the person that's introducing that concept is a credible resource user themselves. So for instance, if we're working in Indonesia to talk to Indonesian fishers about a way that we've seen can be very transformative in managing a certain fishery, we will take those fishers and we'll invite them to meet counterpart fishers from a completely different part of the world, perhaps. And that often means putting fishermen and women on airplanes and getting them passports. It sounds costly, but it's that conversation, that beach landing station conversation, is really where the magic happens. It's where the conversation and the inspiration happens. I can talk until I'm blue in the face, but I'm not credible in any sense. I'm just a scientist. And so the challenge for us has always been to get that very first experience. After that, it's all about sharing that experience. And we merely facilitate those conversations anywhere we can. Technology has an increasingly important role to play, but nothing beats that FaceTime.
Leela, do you want to comment on that too?
I mean, I totally agree with what Al said. I don't know if I can even add much, because that's exactly what we do. I think people have to go to those sites and actually see what's happening and then make their own decision of how they want to engage and adapt a model.
Excellent.
In our case, what we have seen is that when partner organizations start talking about conservation agreements with the communities do not believe them. They think, well, another organization coming here offering things that are never going to deliver, and we agree into something that we are not going to deliver, and everything is going to be as always. So it usually takes a period of time of building that kind of trust so that the communities and the partners are accountable of their work. And actually, once we have a strong example in a site, having them, the community members, share with other communities their experience is what makes this growth.
Do you have a question?
Yes. Mine is actually for Margarita Mora, and you had mentioned that when you talk about conservation, you go to the proper stakeholders. And I know that sometimes that proper stakeholders don't have a direct tie to the government, and that can often create conflict. And I was wondering how you might deal with such conflicts between what the government wants and what local stakeholders want for conservation.
Yeah, well, what we have seen is that you have to see what all the stakeholders think, right? Because conservation is not going to work in certain sites where, for example, you know that there is already a mining concession and they are going to extract minerals from the area, or there is going to be a dam, right? So previously, what we do is figure out what is the feasibility of having conservation agreements in those sites. In areas where we see that there is a huge potential of conflict that communities are not going to be able to manage themselves through conservation agreements, we don't engage, and we expect the partners to look for other alternatives that might help address those issues. In the communities where we work and there is a certain level of conflict between what the government wants and what the community wants, particularly in terms of land titling and land rights, what we have seen is that the conservation agreements are the perfect tool to give rights to communities that are acknowledged at a certain level by the governments, and the communities knowing that they are the stewards of that land and that the government supports those efforts.
Thank you.
This is a question for Leela. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the people that you have in the Guardian programs and how you incentivize them to participate, in particular the man who had the cow who he was trying to protect, and how you kind of changed that frame of mind and how people protect their livestock in the new situation where they're not killing the predators.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. Thanks for asking. I think it's all based on those values that I was talking about at the beginning. So the relationship between Masai warriors and lions goes back for a really long time. It's kind of a love and hate relationship. They hate them because they eat their cows, but they also admire them tremendously because they think they're very powerful, beautiful animals, and they actually see themselves in lions. Right? So that's the part we were really tapping into. And the traditional role of a warrior in a Masai community, they're kind of like the army. They're there to protect the community. That's their role. So we were allowing them to fulfill their traditional duty in the community by mitigating the conflict, also being able to go out and track lions, but rather than killing them at the end, they were like able to collect data on them. At the end of the day, they really want to impress ladies. That's what all those warriors want. And it's really interesting because when we did a survey recently with the ladies, actually, and asked them, would you pick a warrior that has a job, or would you pick one that killed a lion? And 90% of them said they would pick one that has a job. So I think that is, men are motivated by ladies. So at the end of the day, that's what really motivates them to get out there and obviously to fulfill their traditional role as well.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about the conservation agreements. Are they any different than payment for ecosystem service agreements? Is there some aspect that's different, or would you just consider it as sort of a form of payment for ecosystem services?
Actually, the conservation agreements are a tool or a model that can be used in any payment for ecosystem services program, because what they do is have a transparent and respectful negotiation and ensure the equitable distribution of benefits of those payment for ecosystem services. The nice thing of the payment for ecosystem services is that they support the sustainable financing of those agreements over time. So it's not one or the other, it is complementary.
Perfect, thanks. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much for a very good presentation. I just have two questions. Just to add on what Fred was saying, a lot has been done in Africa in terms of conservation, actually turning the whole situation around to the point where we can now see that things are moving forward. But one of the problem, the constraint has been really the resources to take conservation to the next level. What is it that such a panel of influential people are going to do to ensure that the money are put where it is most needed in terms of moving conservation forward? And my second question.
Why don't we start with that one first? And thank you for your compliment to the panel. You could also be up here yourself. Your work is wonderful. Does anyone want to comment on that? How do you think about driving more resources to high impact models in conservation?
It is, if I can start, I think it is a matter of showing results, and you have a really good point. There are many sites where a lot has been already achieved, and those are the sites that keep getting additional funding instead of thinking of new sites that need that kind of funding. So it is, in a way, trying to portray those sites, and at the same time, raising funds, as you know, is always challenging, but it is figuring out how you can prove with the results that we already have that moving forward with this kind of model is worth it, because you are going to get the conservation and actually the human well-being that we are wanting for those communities.
Fred, do you want to comment on that too?
Well, John, I think that's another area where the conservation community can learn a lot and could benefit a lot more through engagement with social entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurial ways of thinking. The crux of the matter, I think, is how you align resources and results, and how you can really have more of a discussion around impact at scale, and a focus on solutions. And just the fact that we're here at a big conservation conference talking about solutions is fantastic, but it's not necessarily the conversation that we always have in the conservation field.
Well put.
And I think we can learn as well from the funders who've been influential in the social entrepreneurship space and the kinds of approaches that Kristin described in terms of what kind of resourcing is enabling, but also what can organizations do to highlight their results and to put a great product out there that attracts the resources that they need.
And John, we'll have to come back to your second question because we're almost out of time, and I want to give each person just 20 seconds to say what you're most optimistic about at the end of today's session or during your time here in your work, however you interpret that, but what makes you optimistic about the Earth right now?
Well, maybe not about the Earth, but I've taken a lot of energy from colleagues such as those up on the stage who I think, and I think that's why we wanted to talk about social entrepreneurship and really put that focus on organizations and individuals that are trying to do things differently. So I think the creative energy is what, to me, is most inspiring within conservation.
Perfect. Margarita?
I am really inspired by seeing so many people working so passionately for conservation and thinking about communities as well. I think that is terrific, and that you see the results. That is what makes me happy in life, and that's what makes me want to do this every single day for the rest of my life.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually that all of your work is focused on engaging communities. That certainly isn't necessarily core to social entrepreneurship, but it probably speaks to where there's a lot of innovation happening in the field right now. Leela?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say one thing that really excites me being here is seeing kind of this younger generation here and seeing how excited they are about things. And people just keep talking about collaboration, right? I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that has happened in the earlier days in conservation, where people just didn't collaborate. And now we know that we don't really, we need collaboration if we want to be able to achieve these huge issues. We can't do it alone. And that's really exciting to see that language being used a lot, and people sitting in these corners having discussions of how they can actually blend ideas together. Yeah. That's exciting.
Perfect. Al?
I would echo that. For me, it's recognizing and seeing that conservation has moved beyond the site level. It's moved beyond this romantic attachment to a place, and it's gone to a network, and these networks are now interacting. And we're now, if you look at fisheries or tropical marine conservation, we're now framing biodiversity conservation through the lens of human rights. It becomes a human rights movement. There's a basic human right to a healthy ecosystem. And when we start looking through that lens, we see opportunities to unlock resources, John. We see a tremendously powerful narrative that can mobilize governments. It can change the course of decision makers. And that's incredibly empowering to communities as well. And so I think we're just beginning to learn the potential of these movements in unlocking resources. So I'm really excited.
Great.
I would like to see more women involved in conservation, certainly in positions of leadership. I think that's something that we should really be pushing for. I'm astonished to see so many panels here that have just men on them, and I think we do need to really recognize that the day should come soon when women are running the bingos as well as running some really effective field conservation programs. Sorry, that's just I was
great. No. That's the future. Well, I'm really excited that part of the Earth Optimism Summit featured a session on social entrepreneurship. I do really think that there's a lot to learn by the traction that this ideology and construct has in the development space. And I hope that today you'll think about if there's anything you heard that remotely challenged a core tenet of your work, I hope you'll think about what we said about social entrepreneurship and kind of embrace that and think about how you can build on what someone else is doing, not think about why your way of doing it is better. And then you can help us all move to a more just and healthy, sustainable new equilibrium. So please also remember that if you're an Earth optimist, don't just think about the glass as being half full. Think about how you can find the picture, and have a wonderful Earth Day. Thank you to our speakers.